You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today I want to welcome as my guest, Carey Wedler. Carrie, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Folks, if you are unfamiliar with Carrie's work, I strongly recommend it. Carrie is a content creator whose focus is to smash through our authoritarian programming with an eye toward promoting peace, freedom, decentralization, and the evolution of consciousness. She's an experienced journalist and was editor-in-chief for the independent news organization Antimedia, which, by the way, was banned. We'll be talking about that today, as well as her special interest in how self-ownership and spirituality intersect. I'll have her full bio and links in the show notes. Carrie, I'd love to start off with your backstory, especially your journalistic background.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up quite progressive. I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents leaned left, and I grew up a lot with my mom having political conversations all the time. And so there was a lot of criticism of the Iraq War when I was coming of age, and a lot of they were big government policies. They weren't being critiqued from a big government perspective, but the war and the police state and the Patriot Act, I grew up kind of steeped in an understanding of I don't think these things are, they don't really align with a free society. And so I ended up studying history in college because I was always drawn to revolutionary movements. This is before I had any idea what I was going to do with my life. I just was always interested in revolution. And I studied history, and I actually went on to intern at a film studio because I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And this happened to be the summer of the Arab Spring, or I guess the summer, it was that year, it was 2011, and I was interning. And I had a lot of extra time. I was a script reader, and I'm a fast reader. And so I'd finish my scripts and I'd read the news. And I had voted for Barack Obama, his first time. It was my first election, and I was very enthusiastic. He had all the right rhetoric. He talked about ending the Iraq War. He talked about civil liberties. And I thought, wow, this is my chance to vote for, a game changer. This is history in the making. And then I went back to sleep. I didn't pay attention to anything. And now I've caught up to when I was at the film studio. And I just started paying attention. I started reading the news, and not everything, but a lot of things I read showed that Obama's policies were very inconsistent with what he had promised. He was continuing the wars. He had put a bunch of Wall Street bankers in office. Everything was going on. And then the more I was active, then the NSA revelations came out with Edward Snowden, and everything just kind of snowballed. And I went from originally just being anti-war to taking a broader picture of what being against initiatory violence means. Because war is quite obviously violent, but the way we're raised, the way we learn about civics in our public education, I went to public school, the violence is kind of sanitized. We don't really hear where this authority comes from or how it's secured. It's just, we have a democracy and it represents us and we're the people, and if we don't like the person in charge, we can vote them out and they work for us. And that programming started to just dissolve because I had gone from Barack Obama to Ron Paul. He was sort of my first breaking away. A friend introduced me. I spent a whole summer. There was a website called ronpaulflix.com, and I spent that whole summer every night just watching Ron Paul speeches. And so I started thinking differently. And then when Ron Paul was really shunned by the media and I watched it happen, I went from thinking wow, we're going to get our guy in and he's going to fix everything, to realizing I think that someone who's capable of doing that, aside from the problems with thinking somebody's going to fix everything for you, that's another conversation. But if someone were capable of doing that, I don't think the people in power would like to let that happen. And that's when I started finding Lysander Spooner and Murray Rothbard, and I went down a more philosophical rabbit hole of living without government and why it's illegitimate.
Perfect. Wow. So along that way, you have intellectual sparks that are red pilling you. Was there any particular moment or work or book or anything that particularly did it, if you remember your moment?
Yeah, there was Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. That was a big one. It's this, he just really logically breaks down the fallacy of we are the government. No, we're not. And he has this great point of if we're the government, did the Jews kill themselves in Nazi Germany because they were the government, right? And me, that really stuck out. I have some Jewish heritage, and that was just I was actually working at a doggy daycare in West Hollywood at the time, and I had some extra time on my hands. So I'm sitting here reading this anarchist text, whoa, checking on the dogs while I'm being radicalized into anarchism. But I think that was a big point. I had one specific interaction with police officers after having read all of this about the state's monopoly on violence, and it became so undeniable. Just watching them with all their guns and their sense of authority, and me not being able to do anything, me having to comply, and it's all literally under threat of force. If I were to disobey, well, they could have shot me. They could have used a taser on me. And that really shattered any remaining programming I had about the legitimacy of the state going through that experience.
Now, we usually think of statism as primarily driven by the myth of political authority or the belief in political authority, and also essentially by the propaganda that supports that myth. That's really what keeps that myth or belief going. And that is the essential root cause of that. But there are plenty of supporting causes and effects of statism that are also psychological in nature. And here's where I want to get to something you emailed me about that sparked my interest. You identified some psychological effects that others don't usually spend too much time on, and you'd identified a few: chronic stress and emotional dysregulation. And I'd like you to kind of tell the folks about that.
Yeah, so that's actually been a big part of my personal journey. I've been healing from chronic illness for the last couple of years by healing a glitched out fight or flight response. And so when I started doing this program last year, after struggling with kind of like mystery illness, I was never bedridden, but something just wasn't right. All my labs were normal, but I was not healthy. I had a bunch of food sensitivities, headaches and migraines, all kinds of different health issues that no one could explain. Just, it sucks. You can take a shot for your eczema. I was like, I'm not taking a vaccine for eczema or whatever it was. And so I ended up learning about a glitched out fight or flight response. And I had been doing this work for a very long time. And I sort of started putting what I learned about fight or flight and how our brains are wired. And I started sort of laying that over my foundation about politics. And I started looking at the way people react to mass events, to politics, to this fighting back and forth for control of the government so that your opponents can't control you. They can't use government to hurt you. So you're going to use it to hurt them because it's better than being the victim. And I started looking at how stressful this paradigm is, this constant fear that someone's going to come and oppress you or violate your rights. And you look around, and I think very few people would disagree with the observation that people are not doing well. There's so much chaos. There's so much stress. There's stress not only from the direct implications of the political system where we're worried that somebody's going to oppress us, but all of the peripheral effects, the monetary system, the economic stress. All of these things build up and build up and build up. And you look at, the numbers of people who report anxiety in general or depression, the numbers of people who reported being stressed and dreading the election. There's a real palpable stress among so many of us. I don't want to say that everybody's stressed out and everybody's caught in fight or flight, but if there's a frequency, to get a little California hippie here, if there's a frequency of the system, it's that. It's the stress, it's the reactivity. And when people, in my view, when people are stressed out and they're scared and they're reactive and they're angry, they're a lot easier to control, because they just want to get away from that feeling. It's human nature. We don't want to feel these the uncomfortable feelings, the discomfort. And so if someone comes along, like a politician, and says, I'm going to fix that for you. Oh, you're worried about this other or that other or this economic condition. I'll fix it. Don't worry. You don't have to be stressed anymore. And that's like a really easy Band-Aid to not have to worry about it and to push away those feelings. And so I think that stress plays such a huge role. And then something that I cannot prove, I do not have a background in science, but something I've read a lot about since going down this rabbit hole is when you're chronically stressed, that actually deteriorates the rational thinking center of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, which is key to fight or flight, that gets hyperactivated and it gets turned up, and then that detracts away from your critical thinking center. So I can't point to a study that says like, hey, did you know that if you're always stressed about politics, you're going to fall for propaganda? I would never claim that. But just looking at the broader patterns of the research I have read about chronic fight or flight and its effect on those parts of the brain, just taking a broader view, it's kind of hard for me not to see a connection there. And I never want to claim anything with certainty about this, but that's been my observation.
That, you just got me thinking about 10 different things now and everything you said there. Right away, I could see almost a circular toxic loop here, where the stress people have, forget what the cause might have been, they have it. And now that makes them more vulnerable to things like propaganda. The ruling class, the elite, whoever they are, will kind of tap into that, see the fear, play into it. Now they're more fearful. They want solutions. That's going to support statism more, because that's going to be exactly where they've been trained to go. The state then has more powers. The state messes things up even more. That creates more stress. Is that a loop that you've pondered yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's this vicious cycle where like there's this root problem. And I don't want to say that every problem in the world is caused by statism. I think there are some that are not. It's hard to be human. It's a complex and complicated experience. But if we're talking about, here's a root problem, this violent authority that is responsible for more murders, more oppression, more harm than any other group I can think of throughout history. But because the programming is so strong, it doesn't even occur to us that there could be another way. You ask the average, I know status is kind of a derogatory term, so I try not to use it too heavily, but someone who believes in the virtue and power of government, you ask them, well, where does this power come from? And they say, well, we agreed to it when we signed the Constitution. That's interesting, because I wasn't alive when the Constitution was signed. Or it's, well, you consented when you were born here. What? An infant? A baby who just came to Earth consented to this top-down hierarchy? Like, the rationality kind of falls away. And so there's already this kind of there's this gap in logic, and then you add in stress, and you add in all of the ramifications of this paradigm of all the violence, all of, the things that it spurs. Just for example, terror attacks. That's not always a result of Western interventionism, but terror attacks started upticking in the West when the West was meddling in the Middle East. So there's a cause and effect. There's arguably a cause and effect here. And then people get more stressed out about terrorism, and then they want the government to intervene to make the terrorism stop. And here we are, however many years later, decades later, there's still terrorism. There's still terror groups, and the government has more power than ever. And they're saying they need more.
It's so interesting what you said before about the brain centers that are affected by this. I have a graphic I had put together for another purpose, and I'll bring it up for the viewers, and I'll have it on the video once it's completed. But I'll describe it to you. It's essentially a graphic of a human head, and I distinguish between what I call the true self and the false self. And the true self is our self, our normal selves in our private lives, where, by the way, we are voluntarists. We deal with each other in an anarchistic way, meaning we expect to own ourselves, we expect to trade with others, we expect peaceful interactions with each other in our private lives. So we are very much voluntarists at heart, and that's our true self. Our false self, as I call it, is this smaller version of ourself in a bird cage, and that's the propagandized part of us. That's the part that buys into the belief in political authority. And it occupies this other part of our brain, so to speak, that's generally isolated from the true self. They do not interact. But the function that false self serves is exactly what you just said. When rationality is brought into the picture as it pertains to the state, bam, that false self clouds the mind. What's interesting is that I position, for no other reason, I position that little cage. It's a profile. I position it at the back, which is, I guess, the limbic, or the animal part of our brain. So I think I've properly positioned it. But does that make sense? Those two distinctions?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I'm still kind of excavating my brain for old remnants of the statism. I think it would be arrogant for me to just assume that I don't have any of that programming left. So especially the last, I don't know, I've been an anarchist for a long time, but when I watch the news, when I always try to challenge myself, and I wonder, is that my false brain is this my due diligence, or is this my false brain kind of stepping in to try to snatch me back into the programming? But I mean, I try to be honest with myself, and I'm yet to disprove my understanding of what true freedom is and the illegitimacy of the state. Like, I'm yet to be convinced that it makes sense on any rational or practical level for there to be a small group of people who presume to have violent authority over millions and billions, and that it's gone well.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point just now about how there still could be remnants of that in our brain. I've spent a lot of time in my podcast and my essays on psychology, the psychology specifically of the myth of political authority. That kind of contrasts with the work you've done, which is the psychology of the individual and how to deal with that. But in my work, digging down, I've found that sort of uncovered some insights about the state that I really had never thought of, but it took a little bit of thought to get there. When I share that commonly with other voluntarists, it's hard for them to kind of get it. And specifically, it's about how weak the state really is. There's actually a whole host of very dramatic and foundational weaknesses of the state, which when you really look at them and sort of disregard the outward surface level appearance of the state, which of course is very powerful. They have the tanks and the bombs and the flags in the buildings and all that, and the SWAT teams. But when you kind of look behind the surface and look at it foundationally, it's very, very weak, which makes it actually a weak adversary in this movement. But when I explain that, I'll notice that voluntarists still sort of, they have a hard time grasping that. They want to cling to that more superficial perspective of the state, which is a little bit more like the Star Wars Empire. It's just this big thing, and it's unbeatable, and sorry, that's it. So I find that an interesting perspective, that we can still sometimes have remnants of that.
Yeah, and I think I have a couple of thoughts. I hope I don't forget them because they're kind of separate. But one thing I want to point out is that I feel like a reason for that is that I'm not saying everyone in our little corner of the internet in this little community does this, but I noticed a lot at in-person events, there was this belief or this tendency to just blame the government for every problem you have ever had. And it becomes kind of like the scapegoat. And it's responsible for many, 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 many problems. But there's, I think, a tendency once you break out of that programming to just hate the state so much and want to blame them for everything so much that it gets this new power over you in an emotional sense, because look how monolithic it is. Like it has all of this violence, and it's true. I mean, you look at all the harm the state has caused. It's not wrong to observe that, but I think it becomes even bigger in people's mind. Not even bigger, but it keeps a large place in people's minds and consciousness. Because it's easier. It's a kind of a crutch. It's like, well, if the government's responsible for all my problems, I don't have to deal with my personal life because, well, the government did everything. And then the other point, I did remember. The other point to what you're saying is it reminds me of a speech that Larkin Rose made in 2016, I want to say, on Acapulco. I reference it a lot. It's called So Small a Thing. And he talks about this monopoly on violence. He talks about how powerful the state is in terms of their firepower and their weaponry. But the so small a thing piece is that the reason that to me it's so weak is that it all rests on a delusion. It rests on people just believing that it's real, believing that it's legitimate. And if that were to change, they'd have no power because people wouldn't be complying and they wouldn't submit. They would no longer buy into all this conditioning that we need the state, that we're obligated to fund the state, that all of the state knows best, and the state, it's funny because Larkin Rose says there's no such thing as the state or government. It's just people who hallucinate authority. So I want to due diligence to him. I want to clarify that. But just for purposes of conversation, I'll stop there because I'm going to start rambling.
No, but that is one of the key points is how weak the state is, because, as you said, it's foundationally weak. It's illogical, right? It doesn't hold up under rational scrutiny. All its contradictions. It's numerically weak. If you count how many politicians there are in the whole United States, if you add the armed military and armed police, you get about 3 million people and no more. That's a pretty darn small number. Then you take that 3 million and you contrast it with the 330 million that they dominate, and you say, gee, that's like 100 to 1. How is it possible one person can dominate 100? It's only if 100 self-comply, and they only do that if they believe they're supposed to self-comply. And the minute even a small percentage of them, 10%, 15% of them say, no, I'm not going to listen to that one guy, it all vanishes. Larkin Rose is one of my important influences for how I've explored the psychology. And taking it from there, it's amazing because it kind of leads you to the idea that it's so weak that really it wouldn't take much to really start things going. But I did want to ask another question about your content style. Your style is very, very, very catchy, yet it's very meaty all at the same time. When I listen to most podcasts, most content, I generally have to up the speed to like 1.25 just so that, I get what I want at the speed I want. I absolutely never have to do that with yours because it's nice and rapid fire. There's a lot of meat on the bone. I don't have to worry about that. I am really, really curious how that style developed. Is it natural to you or are those particular journalistic techniques?
Yeah, well, you're one of the first people to say that I have the appropriate speed in my videos because I'm usually told I'm way too fast. So thank you. I'm glad to know someone I'm on tempo for someone. It started, so when I first started making videos, I just talked to the camera. And I was making videos for Ron Paul, like Google Ron Paul and vote for Ron Paul in the 2012 election. And as time went on and I started making more videos, it really just felt like a necessity to, one, show citations. There's headlines, but I like to show evidence or something to substantiate what I'm claiming. I don't like just saying things. And, that's my, I think, history background of doing a lot of research in college and then my journalistic background as well. And it just kind of became a necessity for me of like, well, if I want to stand on what I'm saying, I want to show evidence of it. So that led to me putting in a lot of images and video and learning to video edit. I think I just am a fast talker. I'm a Valley girl. I'm like that Valley, the world famous Valley girl. That's me, and we talk kind of fast. So we've got like a real quickness to our pace. So I think it's funny because I would get comments on my videos like, "Stop with the vocal fry." Like this is just how I talk. I can't help it. But yeah, I think it just evolved naturally, and I feel like I have so much to say. And I find that, I mean, let's be real, attention spans aren't great these days. I don't know how great they ever were, but there's so little time to catch someone's attention when they're scrolling their feed that I really try to just, like, let's get it in there while I can. And I'd actually like to explore speaking more slowly and doing longer content. I think that's something I'll be looking into the next few years, but it's honestly just natural to me, that cadence and that, like, getting it out, because I genuinely care. These are important things to me, and so I get pretty fired up. And in the past, when I've tried to speak more slowly and I've tried to go slower, it's like I kind of sound like monotone and dead tone, because that's not my authentic style.
Right. Well, and frankly, to be honest, I don't think you have to worry about that, because just as I up most podcasts to 1.25, someone could always reduce yours to 0.75 and just kind of take it all in if they want. So it's right there. It's a click of a button. I wouldn't change anything if I were you. And I think also that it's good because it hits the target audience of the youth. And most libertarian content can be dry, it can be academic, it could be a little boring. You show that to a younger person in their 20s, 30s, and it's like, yeah, whatever, I'm moving on. Whereas that style, especially with the graphics and the rapid fire, I just think it's absolutely perfect for the generations that are growing up on content that comes at them 60 miles an hour. So it's interesting. If that's actually your own personal style, that's very good, because because it's so tight, it's very content organized. So you must spend a lot of time ahead of time putting it together. That is not like something that just falls in together.
Yeah, that's why I don't have that many videos. There's like some space in between videos because, I mean, one, just finding the images and video I'm going to use. And I'm very, very, very particular about the images and video and the headline. So if I have a headline about civilians being killed in an airstrike in Syria, I'm not going to use a video from Afghanistan. Like, that doesn't feel right to me. So I'm like on the internet trying to find a video of an airstrike in Syria that's not too grainy, that captures what I'm trying to say, because even if my words are moving quickly, I want the imagery to represent what I'm saying. So for me, the imagery is so much more visceral. When I sit here video editing and I'm finding cops beating an unarmed person with a baton, or I'm seeing, children in a war-torn country, that affects me. So my assumption is that it's going to affect other people, and that you need to actually see what the state does. You can say, oh yes, the state has a monopoly on violence, but it's easy to dissociate from that. If you actually see the violence, I think it's more compelling. And it also gets me censored way more often because it's sensitive content. So I've had to walk that line and try to find a way to show the violence without it being too obscene, because it gets pretty grotesque.
Also, this kind of ties back to your Antimedia being banned. Can you tell the folks about how that all came about?
I would love to. So I found the Antimedia in 2014. My first viral video, I blowtorched my Obama shirt. And the reason it was viral is a lot of Republicans and conservatives projected their views onto me and thought, oh, she doesn't like Obama anymore, she must be a Republican. So it went really big. Even though the entire ending of that video is anarchist sensibility. It just went like, and that just goes to the programming. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen Westworld, the show on HBO, but they're not Cylons, I'm thinking Battlestar Galactica, but the robots, they'll say, like, they see something that contradicts their reality in this theme park, and they say, doesn't look like anything to me. They just can't process it. And I feel that always reminds me of when you show people evidence of statism and they're just like, nope, nothing. Anyway, so that video led me to the Antimedia, which was just a little tiny group of people who were putting out articles and making memes. They had been inspired by Ron Paul as well. And one of them saw my video. We ended up connecting, and I started writing for them. And we went from, I think I joined at 250,000 followers on Facebook when Facebook was popular. And we took it to almost 2.5 million. And we were reaching a lot of people, and we had some partner networks. Our following between us and our partners was probably 10 million. And we were reaching significant numbers of people. I believe that not us alone, but during Standing Rock, when all those protests were occurring and veterans were heading out to Standing Rock, I believe that independent media was responsible for the media eventually covering that, because there was no reporting on it from the mainstream. And when independent media started pushing it and started getting numbers on it, they had to cover it. I can't claim that for a fact, but that's what it appeared to be at the time. So we had real influence. And this is, by we, I mean independent media at the time, back in 2014, 15, 16. And then after the 2016 election, during which we had criticized both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, then came all the Russia hysteria and all of the fake news fear-mongering. And we were put on a list, some blacklist, I can't remember. It was just some academics list of fake news. And then the Washington Post came out, and they had a story about Russian propaganda and useful idiots for Russia. And they linked to this anonymous group. They ended up actually having to issue a pseudo retraction. They never fully admitted how poor the reporting was, but they did acknowledge that the group they had cited, called Proper Not, was, I don't remember exactly, but they kind of distanced themselves from this group, which was anonymous. They never said who they were, and they put together a list of Russian assets, and we were on that list. This was in a Washington Post article shortly after the 2016 election. And around that time, our reach just kept dropping and dropping and dropping. The algorithms turned against us. And it was October 2018. Wow, almost on 7 years now. October 2018, right before the midterms. Woke up one day and our Facebook page had been just unpublished. We had never had a violation. We were not a page that got fact checked regularly, if we ever got fact checked. And maybe one before I joined, like on a random website. But in the years I had been editor-in-chief, I'd gone from journalist to editor-in-chief, and I was setting the editorial standards. We had never been dinged for anything like that. We had a person at Facebook who had been our rep because we had a big page, and we had someone who talked to us about advertising and reach and everything. And our owner or our founder contacted her and said, what's going on? And she said, oh, your appeal's at the top of the pile. We'll get to it. Never heard from her again. Contacted her repeatedly, never heard from her again. And this happened the morning of October, it was, I want to say the 12th, it's the anniversary's coming right up. In the afternoon, our Twitter was banned. Same day. And my personal Twitter was banned. And my notice said, you have been suspended for the following violations. And it was blank. They didn't even have a reason to ban me. And our other co-founders, at least one of our other co-founders was banned. Our entire page was banned. And it was at that point we were like, yikes, I don't know if we're getting the pages back. This seems coordinated. And we never got official word on where it came from, why it happened, but it appears, and we're suspicious that the Atlantic Council might have had something to do with it. They had created an internal group called the Digital Forensics Research Lab. And these entities had partnered with Facebook at the time to, make Facebook safe for democracy or something and, ensure election integrity. And our suspicion, though hard to confirm, is that they had something to do with it. I know that Twitter, what's interesting, when I first wrote about this at the time, in my research, I had seen that Twitter had also been working with the Atlantic Council, or at least that they had given money to them. And then when I went back to write about it when I was launching my Substack, I could not find it. So I don't know if I was just so chaotic back in 2018 and so stressed that I misread something or that's been scrubbed from the internet. But either way, I think that the Atlantic Council had something to do with it. And for context, if you are not aware of the Atlantic Council, it's like a think tank. It's, I think, vaguely related to NATO, but not the same organization. Maybe it just has Atlantic in the title, just full disclosure, but it's board of directors. It's like all ex-military, ex-intelligence, ex-State Department. The people who run this are about as entrenched as you could possibly be. Their donors are like the military-industrial complex and the banking system. So these are people with a lot of power and a lot of influence, and maybe they had something to do with it. If I had to guess, I would say that they were involved, but to this day, we don't know, and we may never know. And we just didn't want to continue because the landscape had changed so much. Like, we couldn't build up our page for what we were saying, for the anti-establishment voluntarist angles that we were pitching. The algorithms no longer welcomed that. And so we decided to cut our losses and move on. And I still make my videos and I've launched my Substack, but that was a pretty traumatic experience for me.
Oh, that's awful. I mean, that just shows you how the tendrils of statism just kind of get through everything. So it's like it's gotten better because I understand Twitter and Facebook have sort of lifted a lot of these algorithms, YouTube, but it must have put such a wet blanket on things because you don't know if that's just going to come back someday.
Yeah, and my YouTube, oh man, that has not grown since 2018. I cannot get reach on my YouTube channel. And what's interesting too is the whole narrative around censorship among conservatives, like the popular narratives, those start in 2020 with COVID. And that's when everybody became victimized, maybe a little bit before, but even the Twitter files do not address this. And you would think that there would be something in there. They even mentioned the Digital Forensics Research Lab, I think in 2019, I want to say, but that's a full year after we were banned and after these institutions started getting involved in regulating speech on the internet. So it's interesting that we just kind of we don't get much of a mention. It all starts when it can be made partisan, when it's conservatives being censored. And they've taken up that mantle of they're the poor victims of left-wing censorship. But in my view, it's much more extensive than that. And it does not matter. The partisan lines don't matter.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. That's just sad because, it was a lot. It was great content. It was like awesome. It pushed that window forward. It had influence in the journalistic field. We can only hope some sort of resurrection of something like that forms in a better climate. The other platforms, they have potential, Rumble and Odyssey and all that, but really the main ones are the main ones at this time. And it's hard to break through that.
Yeah.
I want to swing back to the psychology because I want to see on this topic of stress and dysregulation, what have you learned about this in terms of self-help? Like, what are there tips? Are there different ways that we can kind of, manage it ourselves with practice?
Yeah. There's a great book. I love plugging this one because this was so revelatory for me. I want to make sure I have the title right. I'm looking at my books. It's called Hardwiring Happiness, but it's a wonderful book. It's very simple, and he talks a lot about the negativity bias, which is sort of built into our brains, where the example he gives is if you were, a hunter-gatherer and you're out in the wild and you hear a rustle behind a bush, you could assume that it's just a leaf in the wind and you could just go about your day, or you could assume that it's a tiger. If you assume it's a leaf and it's a tiger, you're screwed. You're probably gonna die. But if you make that assumption that it's something more negative, you might be more likely to survive. So throughout human history and evolution, there's been this sort of positive reinforcement for having a negative outlook because you need to be aware of the risks. But unfortunately, in the modern world, a lot of things trigger that kind of stress and that negativity. Like where our brains are having a stress reaction to a life or death situation that is not actually life or death. So you turn on the news and you hear about the election, and of course there's violence involved in that, and I don't want to downplay the violence of the state, but we're not in immediate danger. No one's about to kill us, but our brain doesn't know the difference because we're assuming a threat, we're seeing the risk, and that amps us up so much. And something I heard from someone who did the program I did was she said I was bringing adrenaline to every situation, and I realized that was so me. No matter what I was doing, it was like from the second I woke up in the morning to when I went to sleep, there was just like this racing heart quality of my experience. And reading this book, and what he recommends is called soaking. It's so simple, and I love this example because it really works and it does not require a lot of effort or energy. It's just taking a few moments, maybe 5 breaths, 5 to 10 seconds, to notice something positive in your experience. So for like right now, I have a really comfortable couch. That feels pretty good. And it's so simple. Or you're outside and you see a leaf swaying in the breeze, or the sunlight beaming through the grass or the tree. It does not have to be anything fantastical. It's almost better to me when it's just these tiny little details that really bring you back to the present moment, to where you are in your body, and part of it is feeling how that feels in your body. It feels kind of nice to enjoy a breeze or to see some flowers blooming. And it sounds kind of trite. I know that it sounds trite, but if you do it maybe 5-10 times a day, that actually on a neuroscientific level, neuroplasticity wise, it starts changing the pathways of your brain. And then the more you strengthen those pathways, well, the more you notice, and the less the negativity keeps seeping in. And some things I think it is appropriate to be stressed out about. I don't want to act like we need to just whitewash everything and we just have to be happy all the time, even though the world is burning around us. I think it's important to feel our feelings around that, but it's also important not to get stuck and entrenched in them, because I don't think any good comes from just living in the darkness and the cynicism all the time.
I can't tell you how impressed I am at that. And I'm connecting to it. And I'm going to explain how I connect to it. When I thought about what I want to do to contribute to this movement, I thought, well, writing about stuff, everyone does that. Talking about stuff, everyone does that. And it didn't take long before I realized there aren't many out there, frankly, who are looking for white pills. Basically, looking for not just, can-do attitudes, but actual real-world reasons for hope that we actually can reach a free society. And I thought, well, are there white pills? Because after all, the libertarians are always black pilled. They're always talking about the negative. Maybe they're not out there, But it didn't take long to find that, there actually are quite a few. So I thought, there it is. That's the niche I'm going to attack there, because no one else is doing it. And also because I care about fellow anarchists, fellow voluntarists. They are stressed. They are sad a lot. And if there's reasons to be hopeful, well, maybe if I could throw them a few of these white pills, they'll feel a little better. So I certainly didn't do anywhere near the research and understanding you have about it. But I think there's a connection there in that, yes, looking and focusing on the positive is certainly going to be better than always looking at the negative.
Oh yeah, no, I just think it's so important, and I'm speaking from a position of I was always focused on the negative, and it's easy to be. I understand, because these things matter, and there's real suffering in the world, and I'm pretty sensitive, and it's hard to look around and not like the goal for me now. Sorry, I'm breaking up my sentence, but the goal for me now is not to push away the darkness and the suffering. It's to hold space for it while also remaining aware of all the possibility and all the beauty in this world, like especially when you look outside the status system and you just look at humans interacting and helping each other and connecting, and you look at nature. I found that nature has been one of the most healing parts of my journey. Just my entire life I've always loved nature, but when I started doing this program to heal from chronic illness, it requires a lot of visualization. And almost every visualization I do, I'm in nature. I'm with the redwoods, I'm in the Smoky Mountains, I'm in Hawaii, I'm with a volcano. There's something so soothing about that. And I think that that's actually a big piece of why people are so dysregulated, is we're so disconnected from our habitat, our natural home. We spend so much time on screens and just with all this artificial light that I don't think that's the root problem, but I think it exacerbates so much of this dis-ease that so many people have, both individually and on a collective level.
And I think there's also other aspects to this too that I've discovered. So by focusing on the white pills, meaning the specific reasons why, we're going to get to a free society, it puts a perspective on all of the day. So the whole day is better. Why? Because if I see some news item, immediately, this took a little bit of practice, but immediately I'm seeing how I can discount the negative because it's really weak or it's vulnerable. Whereas I can then look at the white pill aspects and see that there's logic and foundation and rationality behind that. So it's stronger. Looking at the state, for example, I have a mindset now that the state is very much just like some kind of avalanche or an asteroid. These are things that we absolutely can't control. We have no power over them. So their effect on us is going to have to be whatever it's going to be in the sense of a runaway train or an avalanche. Now, of course, that's scary to think about. But if we fool ourselves into thinking something we say can actually change that, well, that's a fool's errand, basically. You're not going to change the state. All right, I realize a lot of Libertarian Party types think that in local type elections, they might be able to get some permit fee reduced. And if they do that, great. I mean, I'm not going to be a wet rag on that. But I tend to think more of this social big picture, historical type of perspective. And I want to see us get to a free society. And I do think that living the days through this process is important in order to try to just survive it. And that really was, for me, the motivation for the whole project of my essays and podcasts was, look, if you listen to it, maybe you'll pick up some thoughts and perspectives on the white pills out there, and that might carry you through and help you kind of function.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy, again, like with that negativity bias, it's so easy to look out at the world and see so much that's wrong with it. And I think that I don't want to say that this is an intentional agenda of people in power and the media, but the saying, if it bleeds, it leads. There's something about the chaos and the heavy things that really attracts people's attention. But what's funny is that when I talk about it, one of the biggest asks I get is talk about solutions. Please talk about solutions. Talk about, give us a white pill. And I try to, because to me, I think that it's in itself, it is a white pill to break out of this programming. And it's hard, and it's not an easy process. A lot of illusions get shattered, and it can be pretty depressing. And I think for a lot of people, it's like ripping your foundation out from under you, because we learn from such a young age that this system is virtuous. And it's really an extension of us. That's what we learn. We are the government. Your vote, your voice. Do your part. That we're actually taking action by checking a box or tapping a screen in the election booth. And so I think it's really, in a way, destabilizing. It's a hard process to go through. It's kind of, like in the Matrix, I know it's a pretty popular reference, but it's not easy to cast off the illusions and to see the world for what it is. And so I think that's all the more reason to be looking for the positive, because it is there. And the only people, I don't say the only, but those in power, the ruling powers, the media, they benefit from people being caught in the darkness and terrified and scared and looking to somebody outside themselves to save them.
That's so true. I do think that's probably the key thing there. And once again, it kind of circles back to how difficult it can be for even the red-pilled to maintain a positive attitude, because they more than anyone see the state for what it is. And they see this monstrosity and the terrible effects. And so it is understandable that they would feel this way. One of the things in your work that pops out to me every single time is how you'll focus the content of the particular essay or video on details. So you talk about specific details. But unlike most content, which stays in those details and makes you upset about the particular thing, or frankly, most of it takes a side. So that's why we ought to have a law for the X side of the XY paradigm. No, somewhere in there, you're going to find your position on how it all relates to the myth of political authority. You said as long as we're believing in authority or giving them power, that's what's going to happen. It doesn't have to dominate your essays or podcasts, or your videos necessarily, but it's always in there. Is that by design? And what do you think is the value of doing that?
Yeah, I think it's by design. It's almost by compulsion. It's like I can't not say it. Like I have to say it. It just feels so important. I can't not say it. And I think I made that decision I made a video in 2019 called it's about the world's most dangerous religion, which, spoiler alert, it's statism. And I actually have a kind of a companion video I'm just finishing up now about the most dangerous minority, so look out for that one. I was smiling when you were talking about how the tiny number of people who are actually in positions of authority versus the population, but I'm digressing. So with that video about religion, status religion in 2019, I made a decision to just be more open about the philosophical underpinnings of what my opinions were. And I had talked about it before, and I had written articles about it for the Antimedia, but I would often just go into the two-party politics of it, of, oh yeah, the system's corrupt and this and that, and they're all bought and paid for, and that's all true. But it just, for some reason, with that video, it just became really important to me to like, but why? Why do they keep being bought and paid for? Why does this always happen? Why is there always corruption? No matter the type of government, why is there always this megalomania and this expansion of power and oppression? And so in 2019, I'd say is when I just decided, like, no, I have to say this. This is the most important part. I can talk all day, and people do talk all day about the corruption of the two-party system and the duopoly and two wings of the same bird. And it's important because a lot of people are still locked into that and they're still taking that side. But I think without a deeper historical and philosophical and even spiritual understanding of why this happens, and in my view, it has a lot to do with the statism, it's sort of, to me, that's superficial content. So I always try, not always, but I often just try to bring it back. And I think that probably gets me fewer views than I used to. I think that's a reason why I don't get as many hits because, well, not as many people agree with that. It's easier to do the superficial, left, right sucks and this and that. And I agree. And I'll probably still make videos like that. But I'd rather get fewer views and talk about what really matters in my view and reach one person than to just stay in the superficial and the shock, rage, clickbait. And I like to do I have pretty sneaky titles, where I try to reel people in based on their biases, like the most dangerous religion. Well, who clicked on that? Probably people who wanted to blame Christianity or Islam or the Jews or something. And then they got something completely different. So I do like to do that. I'm a little trickster in that way, but I do like to really focus on that because to me, that's at the root of most of the bigger problems.
In some of my work, I've actually specifically talked about this and I've just made the simple distinction between content as being either conventional or principled. And conventional is what we hear every day on every news outlet. It's like you said, it's the left, right, and that's it. And even frankly, a lot of the libertarian anarchist content ends up being like that. Maybe not so much the anarchists, but certainly libertarian. They're going to take a side. And nowhere in there is there a questioning of the actual state or any mention that this whole thing happens because there is this belief in political authority. And so content like yours that does mention it, even though it gets into plenty of nice specific details, I consider that to be the principled type of messaging. Now, why is that better? In my opinion, it's better because it does strike at the root of the problem. And if it isn't, and it's conventional, I have a pretty negative view of it because it really is just like everything we see out there. It's just arguments back and forth. And it reinforces that illusion that we have something to say. If you really think about it, I've thought about this recently, how on most political-oriented podcasts, even the libertarian types, if you ask the question, what are you doing? Why are you doing this podcast today on this topic? What's the purpose? Now, if the purpose is to just have an audience who's interested in hearing you talk, there's nothing wrong with that. That's capitalism, that's trade, no problem. But if you're saying, well, my purpose also is to change minds, it's like, okay, wait a minute now. I think you're fooling yourself. If the messaging you're doing is conventional, why? Well, how are you going to change minds? Who in your audience is going to be swayed? Most of them already have made up their mind. They're left or right. The few that are on the fence are probably not going to be persuaded by you. And if they are, they're still going to fall on the left or right side, right? So I think to be honest, a lot of libertarians are fooling themselves when they're doing classical, conventional type of messaging, thinking that it's going to have some impact. It isn't. But when you introduce principle in there, you've introduced a new wedge almost into that true false self up there in the head. And you're trying to separate those so that they can, shine the light of reason on that false belief. And that's why I appreciate your type of work, because you've got that in there. So I wouldn't remove it because I think that's exactly the value that it offers.
Thank you. Yeah, it's important to me, and it's for whatever reason, because I think I mentioned I started off just anti-war. I could just so fundamentally see how wrong it was. Just having people going to kill for the state. At the time, I didn't frame it like, oh, they're going to kill for the ruling class. I just thought, like, it's wrong. All these people are dying and innocent people get hurt. But when it became apparent that the entire system is rooted in that violence, you can't unsee it. Once you see it, I mean, some people, I don't know if they ever unsee it, but since you're talking about libertarians, and I did notice a lot of them ended up voting for Donald Trump because they fell back in, well, the left is worse. And there's nothing wrong with valuing the Constitution. I think the Constitution embodies, or at least names, a lot of the real fundamental rights. But there's this, I think, a strong mindset of like, well, we just need to go back to the Constitution and then it'll be fine. And as someone who's read Lysander Spooner, and it really resonated, I think I'm probably going to miss a word, but he said, whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain. It has either authorized such a government as we have had or been powerless to prevent it. Exactly. And I wanted to be a constitutional lawyer. I was studying constitutional history when I was in college, and I love the Constitution, and I really value everything that it allegedly protects. I don't think it really protects it, but I think they were on the right track, at least in the Bill of Rights. They had an idea. And even just the idea of like, well, they should balance the power, but it's like, well, it's all still the government, like, oh, you're going to have this branch of government balance the other branch of government. Well, they're all operating on the same fundamental authority, which we of course understand is fictional, but in this mindset, it's not possible because they share the same authority and perception of it. So I understand why people felt that they had to pick a side and they chose Donald Trump. And they didn't all choose Donald Trump. There were some libertarians who went with Harris because they thought Trump was the bigger threat, but that all still kind of stays in the superficial, which is we're arguing over control or over who has control when the issue is the control itself. And I think if that gets lost, then it's really hard to chip away at the root.
When I commented on that recently, I normally don't take digs. I like to really kind of keep it positive, but I had to because the Trump, the falling in line behind Trump, I kind of got it because a lot of them knew that he was likely to free Ross. And, and Biden, Harris would not have done that. So, I mean, that's definitely something that came out of that. We can say, well, I'm glad that happened. But aside from that, it really was a lot of self-delusion going on. And the way I put it was maybe a little bit harsh, but if you've read Gulliver's Travels, the sailor ends up on the island of Lilliput, and these are the little 6-inch high people, and he's a giant to them. And the author talks about how the petty squabbles of this civilization are so ridiculous to Gulliver when he's looking at them from this bigger or higher perspective. And of course, their little squabbles are all about, the best president is the one who has the highest heels, or, what's the right side of the egg to break, the small end or the hard end. These are epic discussions. And I said, the libertarian obsession with Trump and frankly with politics in general is very Lilliputian. You guys are really kind of just squabbling over petty trivia. Not that that's necessarily going to change their minds, because I think if they're convinced that that's the way to go, that's the way to go. But I also think a lot of the psychology of that myth, tying back to what we said before, is that sort of, hangover of the myth still in that brain that, but there's still got to be a way to make that Constitution work.
Yeah, and it's you want to feel like you can, quote, do something, and this feels like doing something. Oh, well, we have to stop the team that's worse, or the other partisan whatever. We have to. It's going to be worse if Kamala gets elected, so I'm going to do the harm reduction and vote for Donald Trump. And I understand that reasoning. I don't want to just, oh, you're an idiot if you think that. I mean, I've definitely I've thought that, but I don't feel the need to say that. But I feel like that in itself is such an indictment of the system and the Constitution. It's like, well, if your only option is to violate your own principles so that you don't have to deal with somebody else who violates your principles even more, I mean, that in itself to me is the problem. And it takes people who have good morals, presumably, and good values, and then they have to abandon their own values and principles because that's their only option. And of course, I don't believe that's the only option, but I understand how people feel that it is. Because if they're not doing something politically, well, then what? They feel powerless. And that's why the solutions are so important, and talking about these alternatives and, other ways to organize society. I don't like to use society, it's become a meme term, but, society. But for lack of a better term, communities, let's say communities, to talk about these decentralized solutions and the way that people can take action and they do have agency, and it doesn't have to be their whole life, but just to know that there are things that they can do that don't involve relying on political authority to accomplish it, which rarely ever happens. A lot of promises are made and very few are delivered upon.
Oh, yeah, for sure, for sure. Now, I've developed my own real world reasons to think that the transition to a free society has actually started already, even though it's at its baby steps. But at this early stage, it's probably safe to say that the reasons are a little bit harder to see, even though they're real, and they're more like puzzle pieces to where you'd almost have to see a few of them together to start making sense of it and realizing, oh, yeah, this transition has started. But I'm curious about you. Like, what white pills you? What are the reasons that you actually have hope?
Yeah, well, I think the main one and probably the broader view one is that I studied history and I was always interested in politics. And when I look at history, there's been sort of an ongoing trend. I wrote an article about this last year, I think, or earlier this year. There's an ongoing trend of a decentralization of power. And it's not always the case. It's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But people went from believing, and to be fair, I don't know how many people believed it, but the dominant ideology was that there was a person, a monarch, who was ordained by God to have absolute authority. And in practice, maybe people living out in the country didn't see that authority very often. But the political mentality there was somebody is just granted this right by God. They have a divine right to rule. And that's no longer the case. That's not really the predominant view. And as much as I disagree with democracy, and I think it's still fundamentally, it's the same authority, it's the same violence, that was a step away in the evolution of like, well, maybe there isn't just one person and maybe people do have power. And I think they botched it horribly, even with good intentions, presuming they had good intentions. But there's, over the course of history, even from ancient times, like there were monarchs then, and the republic was not really a republic in Rome, or democracy in Greece. It was still oligarchy, but as far as to my understanding, but there's been this ongoing evolution away from centralized power. And it seems, okay, look at today, how many people want Donald Trump to be a dictator? Okay, that's not great. But I still think that the long view of history, however many times humanity stumbles, I still think that it's heading toward that. And something else, which sounds like a black pill, but I think is actually very much a white pill, is that the more incompetent government gets, the less able it is to meet people's bare minimum needs. It's kind of a necessity that people are going to have to find a different way to organize and to live. And I just wrote an article last week about the Black Panthers, who I don't agree with their politics, and Marxists and socialists, no thank you. I didn't agree with them wanting to seek power through government, absolutely not. But this is a perfect example of that, where Black communities were not being served by government. And in fact, were actively oppressed if you look at the history of the laws, especially even from democratic policies, like the segregated housing. And Woodrow Wilson was a huge segregationist. But if you look at all of those things, the Black Panthers said, okay, well, they're not coming to save us, so we'll do it ourselves. And they had all of these community programs. They were feeding children. They were providing services, whether medical care or self-defense or rides to prisons, because so much of the Black community had been incarcerated. There were so many angles they took. And yeah, there were some core actors that was their full-time work, but it was supported just by members of the community who wanted to help. They wanted to either donate time or money. And it became this really free, self-functioning system. And of course, they faced harassment from the government, from COINTELPRO, the FBI, and they eventually dissolved. And I would not have wanted them to have gotten socialist control over the government. But all the politics aside, just the fact that it was possible, and it's an example of what I'm saying, is that the government won't do it, so, well, needs need to be met, and as it turns out, people can meet them. It's sort of like, well, who will build the roads? To which we say, people will build the roads. As they always have. It's just a slightly different mechanism of action that doesn't involve violence. It involves instead voluntary interactions and agreements and cooperation.
That was a great article, too, that you wrote. I learned a lot from that. I mean, I grew up right about the time that the Black Panthers were first getting kicked off, and all we heard was the violence. All we heard was the bad things that they were doing, and whatever actors were doing that are to be condemned, of course. But that's all the news told us. I did not know anything about these voluntary consensual arrangements that they were involved with, community and so on, until I read yours, right?
Cool.
Literally last week when you put it out. So it's like, there it is again. And here is a group that ideologically is very different than what we would think of. But you know what? When they're helping their community out. And by the way, if I remember right, they also helped other groups, not just, say, the Black community or the Christian community. So it shows you that people are people. They want to help. And like you say, they are going to step in and fill that need. So you're right. I think that is one of the bigger picture white pills, is that the government is just naturally so incompetent. It's always been that way. But with the advancement of technology, and especially the electronic age, the computer age, the AI age, the government is going to remain as incompetent as it always is. Its nature is not changing, which means it's bad at doing whatever it does, whereas the private world and private technology is moving ahead. So it's always at a advantage in that sense. So that white pills me too. I'm also white pilled by the decentralization of information flow. And that essentially has happened now. We're there. I know there's some gatekeeping still happening, but let's face it. I mean, I'm having this conversation with you, and it's now when it's heard by someone, it's being heard by someone who it was served up to them. There's no real meaningful gatekeeping between that. Multiply that times a billion times a day. The propaganda of the state is going to have a real hard time competing with that. And the 16 hours of waking time a day of every human being is going to be incrementally less focused on propaganda, which just means that there's less chance they get reinforced in that myth of political authority.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Let's see. We are about at the hour, so we're going to start wrapping things up. Carrie, I wanted to make sure that you took a second to plug your content once again for the folks.
Sure, yeah. So my Substack, it's called Pleasure to Burn. It's just pleasuretoburn.substack.com. It's a reference to Fahrenheit 451. It's the first opening line of the book where if anyone's read the book, it's Montag and he's a firefighter and he's burning books. And the opening line is, "It was a pleasure to burn." But fire has a lot of themes in that book. And since I was coming off censorship, I decided I wanted to call it Pleasure to Burn. So you can find my Substack there. I post weekly, but I'm also on all the channels. TikTok, I'm very much shadow banned. I already got banned once and I joined again, and there's just not a chance I'm going to grow that page. But I am on TikTok, but I'm on Telegram as well. If you just go to CareyWedler.com, it has all my links and you can find it from there, and you can see my spelling right there on the screen.
Awesome. It's great. And on that note, I think we will wrap things up for today. Carrie, I can't thank you enough for taking the time today. It was really great meeting you.
You too. Thanks so much for having me and the thoughtful conversation. I think what you're focusing on is right where we need to be. So I appreciate your work.
Thank you. And another reminder, everyone, be sure to check out the show notes for Carrie's bio and her awesome links. And of course, thanks to everyone for joining us today. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.